All right. We are starting at 2 p.m. We are back to the sisters. So my goal today I guess it's just to do cloth. I guess I'll start with a dry brush. And then I'll move on to cloth. I also might dry brush. So I definitely dry brush the tanks. There's no doubt about that. I may do a silver dry brush. It would make sense if I dry brushed the tanks, I dry brushed these too, which it looks like I did. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So. Let's see if I left myself any notes on your project. Dry brush metals. Okay, good. Basing and harlequins. Yeah, I would have done that because then I did the leathers on this girl. All right. So I'm going to just go ahead and do.
Nicholas asked about the development of the first season and how much of that plot of season 1 was figured out before the writing staff was hired versus how much was created in the room. You're looking for what did a week of work on that show look like? What were you doing?
I wrote a very long essay about that you can find on my website, and I'm not going to be able to cover it. Also, it's
just
full
summarize
of that first year, but I would suggest that you read it because I think it'd be very useful. Look, first of all, Lost was developed in a very different way from most shows. Lost was greenlit off of an outline in late January. And this is a time when most network television, and we're talking about the ABC, NBC, CBS model of network television, have been developing their show since the previous summer. So JJ and Damon write this outline to get greenlit. Now they have to write a script and figure out what the show is and do basically 6 months worth of work in about 3 weeks. So what they did was they hired me and Paul Dini, who is a very well-known comics writer. He was the head writer for the animated Batman. He's a legend. He created Harley Quinn. Jennifer Johnson, who is also just a phenomenal writer and showrunner. She showran The Chase. I worked with her on Cowboy Bebop just now. And Christian Taylor, who was the showrunner. He worked on 6 Feet Under. He's the showrunner of Teen Wolf, right? So we're all together. We're all sitting there, and our job was to develop the world based on sort of Damon and JJ's ideas. So my second day at Lost was the first day that there was a pilot script. And basically on that first day, Damon sat down and downloaded us on everything that he had in mind. There were things like, the hatch, the thing that became the Dharma edition, it was already baked in there. A lot of ideas about what the island was, it being a sort of site for Manichaean conflict over many, many, many decades and centuries and stuff like that. That was all in there. And what's interesting is, I think that, people say that it's only, people only ask this question about Lost, I think, because the show was so popular. But it was no different from a lot of shows. You come in knowing a lot of your basics, and then the day-to-day work of the room is to break those basics down into the episode. So when people talk about Lost, they're like, well, they were just making it up as they went along. I'm like, yeah! And also, we do a lot about what we were doing. You know, we literally figured it all out, right? And we just had this room. We had this 747 full of all this shit, you know. And then week after week, day after day, we look at the 747 and say, okay, we're going to take this part of it out and look at this one. And that's true of every writer's room. So it's very easy to, I think that we earn a little bit in sort of telling the audience things like, we've got everything figured out, we've got 5 years of the story, blah, 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 And I think that really sort of the beauty of the writer's room is that you create a colloquium of ideas, and then they get tested week after week in the writer's room as you break each individual episode. And that evolution worked out so beautifully in Lost, and especially in the first season, which, I'm proud of to the point of arrogance. And it's like that's what the room does. We spent from that day before the pilot was written all the way to the upfronts in May, figuring the show out. Okay, and let me tell you about something that we figured out in that room. The pilot had these little micro flashbacks to the airplane before they crashed, right? And beyond that, there was no plan to do any kind of flashbacks on the show. So the pilot is being made. David and JJ are in post. We basically, we've written extensive character biographies. We come up with episode ideas, stuff as we do for ABC. We're in the process of making the show, and Damon says, well, we should start making episode 2. And we knew that was going to be about a euthanasia thing and all of the stuff that happens in episode 2, right? But then the B story was like early days of latrine or people sorting leaves and stuff like that. Like it was really, these island stories were very hard to put together because they're on an island. And the room sort of came up with this idea of, we have flashbacks in the pilot. Why don't we've got these extensive backstories. Why don't we, that didn't happen until like April or May, And I think that's the thing. And then people use that as an excuse for, oh, you didn't know what you were doing. And it's like, because we were creating it, and it's just the question of, was this for you to be satisfied, did JJ have to come in with like an actual Bible with gold foil on the pages with everything about Lost for you to be satisfied that we know what you were doing? So I think with Lost, because of the nature of that show, because of the hype around that show and all that, we're especially picked over for having done something that all TV shows do.
And your experiences in other rooms, it's that same rhythm, flow, right? You have ideas, and then it gets developed in a room.
Yeah. The different, and honestly, with Lost, it wasn't even all that different from, I ran this show called The Middleman 528 years ago. And basically the way we would do it was, every Friday, I told the writers, every Friday come in with an episodic pitch for the episode story, and then we would decide which ones we do it, put those up on the board, and then the room was working on all of the personal stories going simultaneously because the show wasn't serialized. But look, on Lost, it was the same thing. We needed to figure out what the story was for that week. We knew what it was called the Medusa Corporation originally. We knew what that was, right? But that doesn't mean we know what happens when someone is sick on the island and has to be euthanized. You have to still figure out the dramatics of that and what the characters are thinking and all that. That's every writer's room on Earth. And it's the same way we did The 100. It's the same way that we did The Dark Crystal. It was, the same way Lost was done. You spend a number of weeks at the beginning of your season figuring out the tentpoles, figuring out the mythology, figuring out what parts of the greater mythology that you've come up from the beginning fit in the season, and then you break it down week after week. And it takes that long to do it.
That's so amazing. Rebecca asked us about Lost, and I think now about every show you've been on about pacing.
Yeah.
She's taught Lost as a masterclass in pacing, and she wondered about the process of how you do that in the room and think that through in terms of that pacing.
Well, I think on Lost, we all sat in that room and we went, well, we're masters, so let's teach a master class. No, you know what? Honestly, it's so nice to hear that because you have no idea how Secret of Pants Lost was. Because it was developed in such a hurry, and then because the show was so logistically complicated with our production in Hawaii and we put the fuselage of an L-1011 on a barge to Hawaii before we had a cast. Before there was a script. The first script that JJ and Damon brought in was a script where Jack dies in the first 15 minutes of the show. The whole idea was they were going to get a big star, and the name Michael Keaton kept being bandied around. You'd think for the first 15 minutes that he was the lead, and then like an executive decision, with Seagal, he'd get killed, and then, which led to one of the moments I dined out most about Lost, which was when I read the script and they asked me what I thought. I said, "You can't kill the white guy." So
Amazing.
as a Puerto Rican, I think I can say that. You know, and then when they came back from the notes, I said, "How'd I go?" And they're like, "Yeah, we can't kill the white guy." And I'm like, "Yeah." So, but no, look, Lost was a chaotic and dramatic and incredible experience, and we literally walked into that writer's room, and Damon would come in with a large knife, and he would split his chest open and put all the viscera on the table and say, "Well, guys, that's what we're doing today." And then he'd hand the knife, and he'd pass it around, and we'd all do the same thing, you know. So we were.
Sounds very Pixar, I have to say. I was like, you could use that same image at Pixar.
Yeah, I was like, I feel so at home in this conversation.
No, it's interesting because, you know, I spent 2 years working with that group and with Damon specifically, and so much of what that show is about is primarily, you know, it's a lot of his stuff, but it's a lot of our stuff too, you know, and it is that raw, and it wasn't, and I think when you talk about the pacing, all of that, how I use it now is retroactive to what we did on Lost. We made that first season. We just made that first season. We had no choice, you know, and so we made it. And it wasn't like, I mean, it's like we were being chased by a bear. You don't think about, I'm going to modulate my pace so that the bear doesn't catch me. You're just going, oh shit, I'm being chased by a bear. I better run. And I think after the fact, you know, I sort of looked at it, and also during it, because I was really active on LiveJournal, and I was blogging a lot about how we made the show, especially after it became popular. So I was in after it premiered and you know, we were in, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what we were doing in there. So ultimately, you know, like when we went to the Dark Crystal, for example, or even when I went to work on the third season of The 100, the techniques that we used, that I used, that came out of Lost, were all figured out after the fact.
We actually have a question about the Dark Crystal, which is,
okay.
when you're developing a series based on such beloved IP, Jason asks, but especially if you're a fan already, how do you modulate your expectations about that?
Wow. Well, first of all, you know, it's funny. I never thought about fan expectations for the Dark Crystal, for example, because we had to get everything past Lisa Henson. You know, so it's like she's my boss. She's Jim Henson's daughter. You know, she PA'd on the original movie. She knows what is the Dark Crystal and what isn't. So if I satisfy her, I figured, okay, we're good. You know, and Jeff Addis and Will Matthews, who developed the show, and Louis, you know, we were all big fans of it. We all loved it. We were all enthralled and in just awe of being in the Jim Henson lot, doing that work. And look, I don't, you know, honestly, the Dark Crystal is a very odd one for me. Will and Jeff are brilliant, and they had created this great pilot, and I read it, and I loved it, and I said, what can I do to help? And my role there was to sort of be like an elder presence in the room, because Will and Jeff hadn't really even stepped in the writer's room until they sold their first pilot. You know, they were feature writers and done a bunch of other stuff. So my job was to be that presence in the room. So I didn't come into it with expectations of what I want to do with the Dark Crystal necessarily. I came into it thinking my job is to produce Will and Jeff, is to make sure that they're always at the front, to make sure that they're seen as the creators of the show, to make sure that they have the skills, which they did in spades. You know, but it was just to provide that coaching thing. And what I think happened for me was when I was able to put my ego aside a little bit that way. I was actually a better writer for the Dark Crystal, because there's stuff in my mind that I would just kind of blurt out, going, well, maybe it'll go, maybe it won't. And a bunch of things, you know, like I look at the Dark Crystal, there's a lot of me in that show, and it's not at anyone's expense. There's a lot of Will and Jeff in that show, because it's a lot of Louis. And I think we all came into it with our own sort of expectations of it. But for me, not having expectations was and knowing that the bar was set very high in terms of what we had to satisfy. That was all of the matrix of expectations that I had. You know.
I feel like what I'm hearing, Avi, is like in the room, your job is to serve the show, right? It's never about serving yourself. You know, it's about serving the show. And like even, you know, when you have IP, you were still developing a specific show. Even though you were borrowing from that IP, you had to be serving that specific. I keep repeating myself. But
well, in apropos of your first point, which is you're serving the show, I wish more showrunners knew that. And I wish that more writers knew that, you know. The showrunners, because honestly, I've worked in so many shows where the showrunner's ego was the show, you know. And I don't mean what's on the page, I mean the show. I mean, you're basically in. If that person, you know, is the kind of person who's like a firefighter, arsonist, and a last-minute savior, you're fucked. You know, because all they do is create problems only they can solve, and you know, and waiting till the last minute to do it, and that doesn't help anybody. Yes, look, even if you're the creator of a show, the characters start talking to you. You know, the characters start telling you who they are and what they want and all that, and that sounds very twee. You know, from us writers, when we say, "Oh, the characters started talking to me," well, they do. You know, and then the show starts talking to you. The actual show starts talking to you and saying, "We got to go in this direction." You know, and I'll tell you a story about that. On the Middleman. So, okay, so just the long story short is there was a woman I was involved with in high school who wound up being involved with like this photographer who was twice her age, right? And I saw that relationship and was sort of deeply traumatized by it, and it gave me a real distaste for, you know, younger women sort of with much older men relationships. It's like literally one of the things that I just hate looking at. So I had that thing on the middleman. I'm like, you know, the middleman is 10 to 15 years older than the other characters. He cannot have those kinds of relationships with anybody who's in the friends group of the other character who's a girl who's just got, who's 21, he's like 36, right? So what happened was, as the show developed, he had this incredible chemistry with the character who played the best friend, you know? And it just, I mean, it was undeniable. It was like literally these two actors, and there was nothing between them in real life, but on screen they each looked at each other like I look at a stack of pancakes, okay? and the writers were like, "Dude, we got to get the middleman together with Lacey." And I'm like, "Absolutely not. I hate that idea. I've been traumatized by this trope. I am not doing it." And ultimately the writers did an intervention, and they said, "This is what the show wants to do," and I just had to cop to it. And this is a show that I created. You know, that's sort of the sum of my soul, but the show wanted something that I wasn't ready to give, and it took all the writers to convince me, you know.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example of your ego. And so we have a question. I think this is a Jeff question. This is about Jeff, do you want to ask it when writing sci-fi genre?
We're talking, I mean, you're such a master of working kind of within what we would call genre. And of course, everything is genre, right? But when we're talking about, you know, ideas or properties or tropes that are based on things we sort of know and recognize and love. And I always wondered, like, when you're diving into that, I feel like you're almost making a contract with your audience that they expect certain things to show up. So how do you, like, walk the line between giving the audience sort of those tropes that they want and that you know they want, but not falling into cliche? Like, the example I use is, like, you know, like, the ship is going to self-destruct. Like, we sort of know that that's going to happen in like a space opera type of film, and we almost want to see it, but we want to see it in a way that feels fresh. So I don't know if that question makes sense or not, but I'd love to hear you speak on it.
You know, it's interesting. You think of the Star Wars prequel trilogy, right? And you know, the first movie being very much about giving the audience, you know, that experience. You know, trying to get the audience to have that old Star Wars feel. And you know, the second one, which is about trying to subvert all of that. And I think, you know, the problem with the subversion, you know, especially I think in that film, is that I'm not sure that Star Wars is the best venue to interrogate the folly of entitled and overconfident masculinity, you know. And I think it's not about the you know, sort of whether you want to subvert it. It's about whether the questions you're at, whether you have the correct airframe to answer the questions you're asking, you know. And I think that you have to be very rigorous with yourself when you look at genre material about character drama and things like that, you know, about what the characters are actually going through and what the experiences of the characters within it. And I got to tell you, like, I appreciate all of these nice things you're saying about me. But at the same time, like, I find myself, I think that's the area in which I have the most to learn. And it's only dawning on, well, it's not only dawning on me. I've always known I was somewhat emotionally stunted, but, you know, I've always been a plot inward writer. I've always been a guy who figured out when the ship self-destructs, and then I figure out what the characters have to be and what their conflicts have to be for that whole thing to happen. And that's a perfectly valid way of writing. But ultimately, if you're going to use a trope, you need to be rigorous about the characters really having a journey, you know, because ultimately plot is tropes, character is feeling, and together, you know, to the bottom of the key thing, you know, together the big story. And I think, and look, for example, with Dark Crystal, right? I know what I'm getting into. I'm making a high fantasy show, you know. So there's a bunch of sort of things that maybe, well, you know, if you're going to interrogate certain things, you know, it's you need to be conscious of the venue and what people want from the venue, what the bandwidth is, and what that airport will support. You know, does that make any damn sense?
Yes, totally.
Absolutely. Because the ship blowing up is a metaphor for the interior of the character.
Oh, good lord.
It's a dream metaphor for what's happening inside, so it makes complete sense.
No.
It's like I was just say we can't arrive at those moments unless we've done the work, the character work to support those moments, right?
Exactly. But the best ship blowing up sequence, in my experience, is the last act of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, right? And it's amazing how much Khan finally, you know, igniting the Genesis device to self-destruct the ship to kill Kirk and himself in the process. It is such a, you know, the movie is called The Wrath of Khan, right? So we know what his deal is. But when you get to that point, even though the movie's called The Wrath of Khan, it's almost like, you know, like you're like, damn, he's really angry. You know, and it's like, this is the end point of that level of irrational fury, and you buy it because you've been with that character all through the journey, you know. And I think that whether it's Kirk's character in that film or Khan or whatever, one of the really, and look, that movie's a piece of Pulp Fiction, and it's a wonderful piece, beautifully constructed piece of Pulp Fiction, but what it really does is, if you're a fan of it, or if you come into it and like those characters, you know, you're watching Kirk go through his midlife crisis, and you're watching Khan go through, you know, a kind of, you know, I wouldn't call it a midlife crisis, but he's somebody who's basically been in jail and he's sprung out and he's gonna, you know, get his, and they both have arcs that end exactly where they should, and that's the thought process you need to have going into it. When people ask me, when do I think a script is done, I always say the same thing, which is when you feel like your main character has been through a journey they can't go back from.
I love that. Put that on a t-shirt, please.
Totally. Yeah, just write that down.
You guys are so kind.
That's really great. I have, so a lot of people ask questions, you know, advice for writers. And so Richard asked about original pilots. Original pilots and samples have become more sought after. You know, it used to be spec episodes.
Yeah.
So now it seems mostly original. Is there any purpose to write a spec episode? Like, are showrunners reading them to staff?
I think you should do one regardless. And look, I get it. It's a pain in the ass. It's time consuming. I don't care. Learn how to write other people's show. If you want to be a TV writer and you have, and you know, look, people are coming into this field who, you know, they wrote a great blog, they have a great Twitter stream, you know, I mean, it's great. You know, I don't judge that. If that's how you got in, great. But here's the thing, if you want longevity as a television writer, you're eventually going to have to write somebody else's work, you know, in somebody else's world. And if you haven't polished your chops on doing that, you're going to be really bad at it. And it doesn't matter whether you're like, you know, the fresh new voice of the American theater. Television, whether you're doing an 8-episode, you know, fantasy show for Netflix, or whether you're doing a 22-episode Big Bull show on NBC, television requires that these series have a unified voice. So you need to learn how to do that. So the question of whether agents want it, I think is something you just jettison altogether. You need both. You need a pilot and you need a spec. And maybe you need 2 specs. Maybe you obviously need more than 1 spec pilot. You need more than 1 sample. Don't do it. Wondering whether the agents want it is putting the cart before the horse. It's not about commerce, it's about your own education as a writer. You know? And if I bring you into my writer's room and you hand me your first draft and it looks like a play, you know, I'm not gonna be horribly mad at you. I'm going to be very kind, and I'm going to hand you a copy of the pilot script I wrote and said I would like for it to look more like this, please. You know, there would be a conversation about that. But on the inside, I'd be pretty pissed. You know, because I'm seeing somebody who hasn't had the requisite education to be in this room.
Right. There are a lot of questions about what should I be doing, right? So yes, a spec and an original, and then how do I pick which show to spec? Because there's thousands of shows now, right? Like, how do you know if the people reading it have watched that show and are familiar with what it is? Does that matter?
No, of course not. It's I mean, look, there's like 9 million networks, like it's literally like I get a call from my agent and it's like, there's this show, they want you for their mini writer's room, and I'm like, what's the show? They're like, oh, it's called Coffins from Space, and I'm like, oh, that sounds awesome, I like coffins, I love space, let's do it. And I'm like, where's the show going to be on? He goes, it's on Flimby, and I'm like, what the fuck is Flimby? Is it? And he's like, well, I don't know, and I'm like, you don't know? He's like, well, it's an app or a web page or a streamer, I don't know, but they're getting into television. Right? The show that most speaks to you and that you most want to write on. You're not doing this for your agent. If your agent gets it and says, oh my God, there's an executive at Flimby who's just dying to read an episode of The Octonauts, then great, But the real reason you're doing it is because you want to be a good television writer. And now more than ever, look, there was a time when all of television was 22 episode orders on the air, i.e. when I started working in 1993, when you had to pick a popular show. My first spec was in, I just hit my mic, I apologize. My first spec was in X-Files, If you wanted to be a genre writer, you were a Star Trek, you were in X-Files. If you wanted to be a classy Emmy-winning writer, you were in NYPD Blue. Everybody had an X-Files writer. In 1995 to 1998, everybody had an X-Files writer. That entire environment has changed. You want to sell things, you want to sample, you write spec pilots. I think that's deeply unfair too, by the way, because I also think pilots are kind of the brain surgery of this. I think that the requirements of a pilot are so draconian, and we're asking the youngest writers and the least experienced writers in our midst to write them, for no money, without help. Without the help of a writer's room, without the help of executives. And executives are helping this stuff. I know people don't believe that. That's neither here nor there, but that's the environment we're in. That's what we do now. We write spec pilots.
I think the piece that you said, like, instead of putting it on what your agent wants or what someone else says they want or what someone else says you should do, then it's about like, what do I want to be doing? Right? Where do I want to be writing? I want to be writing in this space, so I'm going to write a spec in this space. That there's this idea like, I just want any foot in the door. I want any job. When if it's not right for you, you're not going to do well in that environment. So to really think about that. Who am I? What's my voice? What do I want to write?
Yeah, what's your widget in essence, right? So what are you really good at? What excites you? So Bobby, let's assume our young writer, our emerging writer has done their homework. They've written a couple of samples that are based on other show episodes. They've written their spec pilots. Let's assume they even have a manager and agent. How do they break in? That's always their next question, right? Like, how do you get noticed in all of the sea of people? So you're a showrunner, you're reading scripts. What are you looking for in those scripts?
It's interesting that writers are asking that because that's actually an agent and manager question. And I get it that writers have to be much more entrepreneurial these days because of the fragmentation of the market and all that. But I don't think the fundamental job of the agent and manager has changed. And I'll answer the question for writers too. But look, at the end of the day, this is a numbers game. And the numbers are this. How many general meetings can your agent and manager get you at the studio and production company level and network level so that a bunch of people know you and like you, so that when they have to staff a show, they're saying your name. That's it. It's a numbers game. You need an agent and a manager who understands that and will try to get you in as many places as possible. And the biggest complaint that I get right now from agents and managers is my agent and my manager, they don't know that many people. There's a couple of reasons for that. The business is so big. And also, for the last year, no one's been in a bullpen. So nobody can run into a bullpen and go, does anybody know anyone at Flimby? And then like this, somebody on the other side goes, I got a contact over there. And then they make the call together. So it's an agent and manager job. But you're a writer, you want to be noticed, and you're not writing a script because you're in your 2 weeks of postpartum doldrums and you hate yourself, so you want to be seen, right?
What? Stop seeing me. No, stop looking at me. Don't look at me.
I'm sorry, Eddie. So, it's like, look, now the best way to do that, anyone can talk to me on social media. I'd rather they didn't talk to me like they do me. I think we're like friends or family. It's a very, it's a good relationship you can have on social media, but you're not best friends with everybody. But you can network so many more, like you can get to know so many more showrunners now, because fundamentally, I think fundamentally there's two kinds of writers. There's those of us who got into writing to get the love and attention that we didn't get and we will admit to it, that we got into writing for the love of attention we never got as kids. And then the second type of writer,
Stop looking at me.
Well, what I'm going to say is the second type of writers are damn liars, because that's why they're in it too. So there's the honest ones and the damn liars. Many of us are on Twitter, and frankly, nobody gets tired of being paid attention to. And it doesn't mean that you should spam somebody, but it means that if you are, if you're a reasonably cool person who's not going to overstep and has a good idea of boundaries, you can get a lot of advice and a lot of relationship with people like you that absolutely know where you've got in the 90s. And that's how. And if you're not a social media person, I think that you have a manager and an agent, it really just becomes about getting the manager and the agent to really. And then there's also this is all the other things. Right now, this is a time when there are more programs, more committees, more fellowships, more contests, more everything, and some of them are even legitimate. So it's for a writer to get attention. Exactly.
This guy's voice drives me nuts.
There's no magic sauce. There's no one way to do it. You're not going to have my career. I'm not going to have your career. And oftentimes that question of how you break in presumes that there's a path. And there's no path. We're all just like water molecules bouncing off each other. Yeah, exactly.
So our last question here, because I know we're running out of time, is okay. So now our emerging writer, they've done their homework, they've got the agent and manager, they've actually gotten in the interview with you, and you've chosen them to be in your room. They're showing up on the first day. What is your advice to those young writers coming into your room?
Don't be a Dr. No. I understand that your critical faculty has developed, especially now that you're on Twitter and you talk about all the stuff you hate, which you shouldn't do.
Right.
If you can't fix it, don't break it. It's that simple. If you don't have an idea to pitch in place of the thing you don't like, just listen. It's okay to just listen. And if you're not talking enough, somebody's going to tell you and it's going to be fine. And also read the room. There's some showrunners who just want an audience. I don't like working for them, but there's some of them. There's showrunners who want to be. You just have to figure out what your showrunner's management style is. The moment you get there, you should be observing, and not necessarily looking to make your mark. However, I would also say this: when the showrunner says everybody come in with 5 pitches on Friday, and Friday rolls along, I would say the other thing you should do is always volunteer to be first. I think we talked about this at the other panel, and people were asking questions immediately. Always be first, because if you raise your hand first and your idea is brilliant, you set the tone. If you raise your hand first and your idea sucks, then the showrunner will say, this is not quite this is not quite that, or whatever, and then they'll move on. And by the end of the day, nobody's going to remember your idea sucked.
You will know.
But essentially, every piece of advice you just gave,
Yes.
asking the person to put their fear of their anxiety of themselves and their ego and how will I appear and how will I look and I have to be smart, so I'm going to say everything that's wrong. You're asking them to turn all that off and be present, to observe the showrunner, observe the room, listen, think about the ideas about the story. Everything you're talking about is about being present as a writer versus walking in with your fear, which is going to trigger your ego, right? And it's hard to do. Believe me, I remember the first day walking into a TV room. It's hard to do, but that's the goal to do. I think it's really important for any room you walk into. You could be walking into an interview with a manager. You could be walking into a feature room. You could be walking into a room at Pixar. It's the same process of you've got to get present with the story and what's happening in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think ultimately, few people hate themselves as much as I do. Okay, and few people hate me as much as I do. And that makes it real easy to go through life. But about halfway through my career, around the time when I quit Lost, and that was about 10 years into my career, and I walked out and I remember after everything I'd been through on Lost and the crazy, insane roller coaster of popularity and everything that happened on the show, I remember sitting there for a second and I said, a showrunner can tell me that I can't write their show, but a showrunner is never going to be able to tell me that I can't write. I am a writer and I am good at this, and that's why I was working on this level. And I can't continue to pretend that I have imposter syndrome or whatever. The math is just way too much in my favor. So it was actually harder to make peace with the idea that I'm good, competent, and worthy than with the idea that I suck and I'm an imposter, because that's actually ultimately a very comfortable place to be, because you know what everything is. When you say I'm good at this and I'm going to go into the great unknown, you're going into the great unknown, right? And look, for me, the great unknown right now is it's improving my understanding and exploration of character. But the moment that you say to yourself, I'm a good writer, the showrunner read my script, they liked it, they hired me. And all I need to do is be here, and not be worried about what they think of me, whatever. I'm in this room, I earned this seat. And you can be there, And look, I think that the best analog for it is the Code of the Samurai. The samurai suit their dead before they go into battle, so whatever happens in battle, fuck it. And that, I just remember, having quit Lost and my last day as I was leaving home in this band response, was very sad about it. But nobody wants to quit the most popular award-winning show on television. Okay, so there was very mixed emotions. And but I remember just having that moment because I was going to go work on another show, and the showrunner for that show was somebody who was known to be a very tough writer. And I just remember going, yeah, but fuck it. I'm going to pitch everything I can. I'm going to leave it all on the table, and if they don't like me, that's on them.
What pisses you off about writing?
What pisses me off about writing? When you write an entire script and there's some foundational premise of it that's wrong, but you try to get away with it, and then you give it to your friend, and they go, dude, there's a foundational thing wrong with this. And you're like, oh, just give it to me. I've written so much in that kind of delusional state of, no, it's not a problem that I have a monstrous karma go in the middle of my forehead. That's fine. It's going to be fine. And you're like, oh, the problem here is the character's got to have a monstrous karma go in the middle of my forehead. Okay, I guess I got to go burn it off and live with that pain. It's awesome.
And then the follow-up to that is, what brings you the most joy about writing?
All of it. I love writing. I don't have hobbies. I'm not a functioning person. I don't have hobbies. I like going to the movies. I like watching television. And my hobby is writing long memoir essays. Everything that obviously my children and my wife are the most important thing in my life, but my relationship with my daughter is mediated, by her love of the Avengers. That's where we bond. I mean, it's like, so honestly, I love writing. I love sitting down at the keyboard and banging it out, even when it's really frustrating. It's what I do, and I'll talk. You know what a scenic writing is? It's a kind of art that's gotten a lot of traction recently, where you literally create letters and they don't mean anything, but you're organizing them like writing on the page. So you create, and it's I mean, I love the work that a lot of people are doing. I literally developed like an alien language, and I spent most of the time I doodle while I have this scorching case of attention deficit disorder, so I need to doodle while I'm in the writer's room so that I can actually be present. And for most of the Dark Crystal, Blood and Treasure, and Cowboy Bebop, I must have drawn about 500 note cards of this alien language. Okay, because even while I'm in a room writing, the way that I love the scratching on paper so much that I'm writing fake words in a fake language on a page.
Amazing.
Don't be like me. Have relationships.
Oh my God, it's amazing.
Smoke
Okay,
drugs
so
and have a real life, guys. You don't want to.
and so our last question is, if you could be remembered for any scene, what would it be?
In the Middleman pilot, the premise of it is that super intelligent gorillas have escaped from a lab and have decided to earn their keep in the world by taking over the local mafia. And there's a scene where there's a silverback gorilla in a strip club. And he's running his mob empire, and I got to do that on television. Like a silverback gorilla in a tracksuit, a Tony Soprano tracksuit, right? In a Tony Soprano strip club, like running his mafia business before. You know, it's either that or it's in episode 7 of The Dark Crystal. We have to do an exposition dump where we have to explain the entire mythology of the Dark Crystal to the characters in the show, and it is the most bananas concept. Like I couldn't begin to explain it to you. It's like there was this planet called Thra. There was a crystal in the middle of it. The crystal spawned this woman named Agra, who was sort of like a weird imp with a third eye, and the crystal was also her heart. And then the planet was invaded by another species called the Urskeks. And then the Urskeks took control of the crystal and tried to purify themselves. They split into 2 beings.
How do you remember it all?
It's insane. You can't explain it. Okay, so, and I had this idea to have the puppets do a puppet show explaining the mythology. And again, I am proud of this to the point of like being insufferable. But like they made it, they shot it, we got it past all the goalies, and they made this thing. And I remember just going like, oh my god, like, look, I'm sure I've written, I don't know, but this is just like I'm the guy who did the puppet show in the puppet show.
Oh my god, you're so delighted. I love it. You're so delighted. You're so delighted.
So delighted?
Look, this is what everybody listening to this podcast wants. This is when you're gonna know it. You know, I went into a room and the Jim Henson Archives had given us a framed picture of Jim Henson, Frank Oz, and Gary Kurtz. Gary Kurtz produced this little independent film called Star Wars, looking at a puppet. And it was sort of a picture of the 3 of them at work, right? And I had seen that picture in Starlock magazine when I was 13 years old. And I went to work at the Jim Henson Studios in a room that had that photo. And then when the making of book for The Dark Crystal came out, my daughter was really, she can't watch the show because it's nightmare fuel, but she was really into it. And she knows the names of all the mystics and the Skeksis and everything that she needs to know. And I opened the making of The Dark Crystal Resistance book to a page that has a photo of me on the set. And I realized that she went, Daddy! I'm like, who's that? She's like, that's the collector. And I'm like, who's that? That's Jen, that's Rianne, that's what. And then I opened the page and I'm like, who's that? And she goes, Daddy! And I'm like, I got to literally walk in the footsteps of these wizards that I worshipped when I was a kid. And my photo was in one of those making of books. And, that's it. That's, like, you can be rich, you can be famous, you can be whatever, but it's like, this is the reason. It's I helped further Jim Henson's legacy. My God. It was so wonderful.
Yeah. Beautiful. I mean, that's, yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys, and I hope I will at some point meet you both in person.
Yes, I hope so too.
Of you. So
Check out Javi online. You can find him on Twitter under his handle. Ready? At OKBJGM. Yes? Did I get that right? I'll say it again because everybody's listening and they're walking their dog and listening. At OKBJGM. He also has a link in his bio there to some incredibly helpful writing resources. It's really good. Google him, guys. He writes amazing writing essays.
Thanks so much.
Oh, and the thing I want to say, I'm sorry. Also in that page, I have a page where I have PDFs of pretty much every pilot I've ever written, examples of lost scripts, feature scripts I've written that didn't sell, Bibles, pitches, like the entire history of my development, how I've developed and all of that. And I'm not putting it up there so that you can do it like you can do it any way you want, but it's just so that you can see how. I found out most people don't pitch until they pitch, so I'm trying to get these resources out there. So if you need models for some of this stuff, I can put it out there.
Amazing resource. I'm going there as soon as we're done with this.
You don't have to.
I know.
I mean, on a professional and craft level, I'm looking at these situations. So, cool. Well, thank you so much.
So thanks for tuning in. And if you haven't yet, please join our Facebook group. That's the best place to ask questions and get feedback from us and our other fans. And if you have an anonymous question, you can email us at thescreenwritinglife@gmail.com and we will do our best to get to it. We have a lot of emails over there, so we can't get to everything.
So please drop us a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps us out, helps us keep going.
Remember, you are not
amazing episode of TSL. Thank you so much to Javier Grigio Markswash for that amazing interview. Javi is just such a generous writer, and he just gave us so much today. And if you haven't been to his website, there are really tons of resources there. Unsold pilots and features and pitch decks and models and just anything you could need. So I have linked Javi's website in the description below. You should definitely check it out. All right, now it's time for some of your amazing reviews, courtesy of our awesome audience. I'm going to start with That's No Moon, whose review says, Screenwriting and mental health asset. Come to this space to learn that your writing heroes are mere mortals. They too have to slog through the mud while balancing the many planes of life and work. Thank you for the transparency and vulnerability. That's No Moon, that's why we're here. Thanks for being a listener. All right, next up we have a review by Gup, who says, Great listen. Insightful, helpful, funny, human. A good listen for any writer. Finally, Tim Hume says, This is a fantastic screenwriting podcast. I love this podcast. Is it for you? Take this handy quiz and find out. 1, can you read or write? If yes, score 3 points. 2, are you currently a writer? If yes, score 2 points. 3, are you or do you want to be a writer? If yes, score 4 points. 4, are you a human being? If yes, score 1 point. 5, do you have emotions? If yes, score 2 points. 6, do you have vulnerabilities? If yes, score 3 points. 7, do you want to experience a sense of community and less loneliness? If yes, 7 points. Finally, 8, do you want to learn more about being a screenwriter? If yes, score 5. He says at the end, if you scored more than 2 points, this podcast is for you. I love that handy little quiz, Tim. Thank you so much. Finally, we have No BS in NYC, who says that this is their official favorite podcast. I'm in love with this podcast. Every episode is both educational and motivational. The hosts are charismatic as can be, and the content focuses on writing and development techniques and tools of the trade, as well as the business aspects of being a writer. It's an utterly engaging, holistic approach to growing as a screenwriter. Keep up the great work. We will keep up the great work. Thank you for those reviews. And the reason we read those reviews is to not only feature your amazing writing on our show, but because it really, really helps us. And the more reviews we get, the more visible we become, the longer we can do this show. So if you haven't written a review on Apple Podcasts yet, we ask that you consider it. You know, those 5 stars in that review really help our visibility. Or if you haven't joined our Facebook group, I think that's a great idea as well. There's a huge community over there. If you have questions or concerns or just need some support, that's the place to go. And I think that's all I've got this week. So, as I say every week, y'all, happy writing.
Constantly receding into the future when I finally arrive and I'll be enough. So in your case of a sprint, it's like, okay, well, if I can write 2 hours perfectly every day with no interruptions until I finish this, then I'm enough. That is deeply demotivating. If the network loves the script, then I'm enough. Deeply demotivating.
And does this wrap into, because I know we have a hard hour today, and I just want to, why needing to be chosen, right? I think I think it's right in there too. Like, well, if I'm chosen, that's enough.
Exactly. Right. And it's the Oprah story, right? If Oprah loves me, if Oprah had said, you're the best writer, you've written the best self-help books that have ever been constructed now or forever in the future, and you are amazing, I want you to be my personal guru, would that have been enough? I remember when my first agent said to me, so I want to know what's going to be enough for you. Is it the New York Times? He said, how many weeks on the New York Times? Like, right? We all have these stories. There's a great old story in one of Sue Bender's early books. I think it was An Everyday Sacred. She went and spent time with the Amish and wrote about it in the 80s and 90s. And she, not an author, not even thinking about it, she was a ceramics person, wrote these books sort of just like, mistake. And she's in the greengrocer, and her neighbor says, hi. And she said, oh my God, you'll never believe, what happened? My book's a bestseller. And the neighbor looked at her and went, what number?
Oh my gosh. It's like the critic manifested outside of yourself.
But it's that thing. It's like, how are you ever going to be enough if that's your standard out there? I'm not sure.
In Hollywood, the same thing. You can be nominated, blah, 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 but there comes a point where they're like, what are you doing now?
Exactly.
What have you done since then? It is, you can't let that be your value.
No.
Because that's a business churning things through and doing widgets, but we're not widgets, right?
We're not widgets. So if we are waiting to be chosen, in that way, we won't create, we won't put our work out there. I mean, I've been there so many times. And for me, choosing myself became about developing a business where I could create income and have a direct relationship with clients and students and customers. So that if I do get chosen by Oprah, or I do get chosen by a speaking agency, or I do get on a bestseller list, it's great. It's like, and I got an award for the book a couple weeks ago, and I was like, oh, that's nice.
Yay, congratulations.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're ready when that stuff comes because you've got all of that underneath you. And then the very last one is be seen, right? Is that right?
Yeah, it is. It's be seen, and I think that's the one that is the hardest for a lot of people.
I said this is my particular area.
Do you like to be seen or not?
No. My safety, when I was a kid, it was the safest thing was to be invisible.
I remember that story, right? Yeah. So to me, be seen doesn't have to be on social media. It doesn't have to be public. It may need to be for your particular ambitions, but it really means first and foremost seeing yourself. Back to the designer question. I see that you want this. I see that you want all the awards, and I see that you want those characters to be amazing, and I see that you want the best actors, and that I see that you want that. It may never happen, but I see that you want that. And then it's sharing it with someone or someone's, and you two do this with each other so beautifully, that you trust. You know, it's being seen by someone or someone who you trust. And then from there, it's building the chops to be able to be seen on a larger stage if that's part of what you know might be involved in your career, and developing the ability to not be destroyed when someone leaves a one-word review on your book. Don't. Right? And you can just laugh at it. You're like, really? Did that make you think to go on Amazon and give me a one-word review? Don't. I mean, I can laugh at it now, but I just wish you both ways so I didn't see it.
You elicited such a strong response.
Thank you. Very
I was
positive.
gonna say,
And left a review. Like, I've never left an Amazon review unless like it was something I really, really cared about. So someone cared so much. So it wasn't the response you want, but you still did.
you moved them. You moved them.
So congratulations.
Oh, God.
That's a good one too. A one word.
Yeah. And having read the book, I could say it's the opposite of dumb.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is the opposite of dumb. So that's somebody who's like, I'm not listening.
Okay, so Jen, while we have you, you talk so much about, self-forgiveness and self-compassion and how, that's not just woo-woo language that like self-help people use. It's really important tools that we actually need to create productively. And that's been a huge change for me. I feel like I used to have kind of like this skeptical sort of, squint my eyes view about self-help as like a space, when actually it's a really important part of being our best creatives. And I feel like because we have you, that whole theme ties really closely into a question we got on the Facebook group that comes from Katie, who said, I haven't written in weeks. My job that pays the mortgage is in high demand right now. I'm so frustrated because I have nothing left for creativity. Who has a cure for this? And happy Friday. And Jen, I just felt like you would be able to address that question so well.
Thank you. I think you should be skeptical of the self-help space. By the way, there's a lot of stupid stuff in it. But self-compassion has a ton of science behind it. In fact, the science is 100% clear and all in agreement, which is that self-compassion works better to motivate you than anything else. And whipping ourselves, beating ourselves up, constantly comparing ourselves to who we think we should be or who we were yesterday is extremely difficult. So what I hear in this question that I want to gently point out, because it reminds me of my younger self when I graduated from film school and was trying to be a screenwriter, and I was working at CAA as a reader. So I thought if I wasn't reading and reviewing books, I should be writing. There was no time for fun. There was no time for anything but push, push, push. And I got into one of the worst depressions of my life. So we have to be aware that life has its boundaries. It has its time. There's things called jobs and money and children and people dying, and those are reality. And I think so much of the world of creativity is set up as, if you don't create every day, if you don't write every day, Stephen King, I love you, but that was bad advice. 1,000 words every day, no matter what. That works for him. And right now for you, it doesn't work. So are there ways that you can touch your story world? When you're on the commute, if you're commuting now again during this weird in-between time, is there a way for you to turn everything off and be with that story? Imagine yourself there. Is there a way to be reading a craft book and making notes that are going to help you? Are there little ways to keep that creativity and that relationship alive? Can you hear my dog?
Yes.
So, yeah, just don't give up on that identity. Don't give up on that conduit.
And you had good, solid suggestions, which is good, like reading a craft book or taking a note. I think,
Or getting to, doing the same thing you did with your son on movies.
And just so that I love the idea of your identity stays the same, right? But I did that. I went into a job in an agency, and when it got my identity became what the agency wanted me to be, which is there till whenever, like 10 o'clock at night, last person in, first person out. What are you wearing? What's your hair like? Are you on the ladder? These people are getting jobs before you. And suddenly all of what you want and who you are is starting to shift over to that. Versus, wait a minute, this is a job that I'm doing in order to do this. And again, you may not be able to write right now because the job is getting so big, but where is the value system and what do you want? Is it the job or is it the thing the job is enabling you to get to or do? Do you know what I'm saying? Like I got it all backwards. It all shifted out, and it took a big wake-up call to be like, wait a minute. Literally years and years and years later, because my identity so became about that flow and what their priorities were. And again, that's nothing evil about it. Nobody was Machiavellian, like, we've got her. No, it's like especially if you're going to work at an agency as an assistant, you have to have super strong boundaries too, right? Of what your identity is, that you keep in your mind why you're doing this. I think that's also super.
And sometimes that happened to me at Pixar. I'm so proud of the work I did at Pixar, but it became my identity rather than, people would say, what do you do? I would say, I work at Pixar. It wasn't about, I forgot I was a writer. That's why, Meg, when you said, who are you? What do you do? I said, I used to be a writer because I'd forgotten, because the work I was doing was so satisfying and I was so driven to be better at it and to learn and grow, but it took the place of my voice so much, which is, why I moved on, so that I could tell my stories and learn and grow in another terrifying direction. But it became so much my identity, and it was much easier than remembering and doing work.
Here's Jen, such a beautiful advice that identity, all it needs is little bits, right? Like if you're in a particularly hard time or job crunch time, that's okay, that happens, right? But just if you keep that little bit of identity going, so that when the ebb flows the other direction, you're there. You've still been thinking about it, reading a book about it, whatever. But I think that's awesome.
Yeah, it's always so inspiring to hear stories of people who are working full-time jobs and still managing to stay in touch with their growth and learning and craft and in some other capacity, right? Because I wasn't able to figure that out. So it's like, how do people do that practically speaking, right? Is it take a class? Is it read books? Is it join groups? What can you do when you have a full-time job that's not in the industry to stay?
And especially when, because writing is confrontational and driven inside of yourself. So it's like you have to really, like we talked about today, know yourself, so that when the question comes up, are you going to that party tonight or are you going to write? Going to the party could be great because you need to rest, you need to connect with people, it's exactly what you need to do. Or it's total avoidance because the writing is getting hard, you're right up against the lava. Hey, I'd rather go to the party. There's no one answer, right? It's so, where are you right now? Know yourself and what this is really about, right?
There's no one answer, and we want one answer. So that's why we really should call like Stephen King or this show or my show or anything. Like, just tell me what to do. But it's that relationship with ourselves. It's being able to be in that, settle down and listen and experiment, and know that we're also changing and growing. Right? When I've gone through really hard times in my life, there wasn't anything there that was going to be for creativity. But it's so much more restful when we can mindfully put it aside and say, okay, yeah, for this, my first husband had cancer at the same time my dad was dying of pancreatic cancer. That's not a creative time. So what if I beat myself up during that time? I guess I didn't have anything to do. I don't remember what was going on creatively or professionally during that time. But there's just times like that. work time, but what you said, Meg, is so important because we have to keep that desire alive and we have to keep our relationship with it and seeing ourselves through the design. Maybe it's a conversation with a friend. Just remind me that I'm going to do this.
Oh yeah, I think that's super important. Lori and I use each other for that all the time. I'll be texting her and I'll be like, okay, I'm dating this, blah, blah, blah. And she'll be like, remember you said. Right.
Shut up. All right.
And if you know what, if you don't have that friend in your life, to our listener, our Facebook page is super supportive. There's people who will help you. I love on the sprints. People say, okay, what I want to get done is this. And then they're like, I didn't get it done. Everybody's like, but you did it. So, like, it's very, like, witnessing, like you talked about. And it's about witnessing. It's about supporting no matter what. You just showed up. Congratulations. And I think that stuff, doing it, can change your brain. Like, it does. Your relationship to yourself in a chemical way. It takes time, right? It takes, you got to do it. You can't think about it, you got to do it. But you got to do it and then you get to reflect on it. Yes, to reflect on it. That was super important to bring it into your parts of your brain. They're like, okay, yeah, you really did that. Okay, and nobody died. Which is also why a great, like either on the sprints or a friend saying, Lori, like I say Lori again, you also turn the description this week, right? But to have this, you can have a person reflect back to you. Remember, you also did this, and by the way, that's many end of Act 2s and features. There's a main character who's down in the why bother, and there's another character next to them saying, yeah, but you know, you say that you started this journey by saying that the ocean's dangerous and you can't handle it, and yet you met sharks and you did this and you did that, and like that character, that voice of look at all you accomplished, change your brain. Is actually the end of that too. Okay, sorry, just saw a correlation. No. It helps screenwriting for a moment. It does, but when you think about your craft, I mean, that's the amazing thing about telling stories is actually it's the best kind of self-help because that's exactly how our brains work. We're narrative creatures. So yeah.
And I will say though, it is so much easier to negate any kind of progress or sit around in the negative. Which is why the Facebook group for me is such a great refuge. Like I can go there and be like, this is a positive, supportive environment. So I'm allowed to be positive and supportive, right? Rather than there are places where it just feels like if you act that way, which, you know, I'm a like cynical, you know, I like the darker way of view of life because it's easy and I can make it funny. Right, but it's sort of a delight to be able to have this little spot, which happens to be on social media, which is crazy, that feels safe to reach out a hand and say, I need some help, I need some support, or to be that hand that grabs that person on the other side. That metaphor is terrible, but you guys get what I'm saying, is that finding those spots of finding those supportive places is so vital.
I think it goes back to what you had said at the beginning, Jen, about survival. That because I also have that very strong, anxious, negative brain, and I always think of it as trying to protect me. But you know, if I try to think of it as cutting it out, it's never going anywhere, right? Because something happened in my childhood that my brain thought to survive this, you can't hope, you can't desire, and it's like a hypervigilance, right? Turned on. Right, to the negative.
Right.
And it was trying to keep me alive. Like
right.
It's not evil. It's trying to keep me alive, but now it's habituated. Right? And I feel like the Facebook group, a friend, the writing process, all that stuff, getting enough, all these beautiful steps is rewiring your brain to say that is not the only way. And I love what you said. Like, is that true? But just getting enough consciousness to catch the story going by. Is you're halfway there, even more than halfway there. So much of, and then you can put that into your writing. And I love this stuff because it is what Act 2 is in your script. Act 2 is your main character coming to these things. Is it true what I told myself in Act 1? What we're talking about today on the show is a lot of what your character will go through in Act 2. Do I really want this? Right? Who am I? Right? All of that stuff. You could take all of these steps and run your character through it and just see what happens as a writing exercise.
That's exactly right. What do I really want? What's the
has been amazing.
There are no
Great.
magic
I honestly hope
potions.
you do 3 more shows and still just scratch the surface of your incredible book. So please, also to our listeners, check out Jen's podcast. We did a stint with her there, and
I can hop in here. I'll go ahead. If there's anyone to endorse the show, I'm not only a huge fan, but I also do produce Jen's podcast. But I can say without pause that every single person listening to the Screenwriting Life right now will love Jen's show. We bring on creatives who talk about the nitty gritty and the challenges, and I think in the same way that the Screenwriting Life can support you emotionally and give you practical takeaways, we're doing that over at Create Out Loud too. So the name I threw out there was Anne-Laure Lecomte. I think first, go listen to Megan Lorian's episode.
Oh, it's so good.
It is so good. And you'll get to see a different side of Megan Lorian that you didn't know. So start with that, but then check out Anne-Laure Lecomte, who talks about time anxiety and toxic originality. I'll just give the quick pitch. Time anxiety is that voice that tells you you don't have enough time right now to write, if you don't have enough time in your life to write, and why both of those are myths. I feel like that episode for me blew my mind. And then toxic originality is this thing where you say, it's not original, so I shouldn't explore it. It's not like, I'm not totally original, so why should I write? And she debunks both of those so well in that episode.
Good. That's so good.
Can't wait
Yeah,
to listen.
so check those out, and Jen's the best, so check it out.
Thanks for tuning in, and if you haven't yet, join our Facebook group. And thank you to Jeff, our producer, and to Jess, our intern, for everything they do to produce the show and support us.
Yes, thank you guys so much. And drop us a review on Apple Podcasts. Maybe not the one-word Bell review. We'll skip that one. But please drop us a review so we can keep doing this.
And remember, you are not alone, and keep writing.
Another amazing
The script art.
KCRW sponsors include ABC, presenting The Connors, the critically acclaimed comedy series starring John.
I don't know.
Goodman, Lori Metcalf, Sarah Gilpin, and Lacey Goranson. Watch full episodes at abc.com. Eligible for Outstanding Comedy Series in all eligible categories.
From KCRW, I'm Kim Masters, and this is The Business. Fern Cox made history as the first transgender person nominated for an acting Emmy for her role in Orange is the New Black. She's been a vocal advocate for trans representation on screen, and last year she executive produced and appeared in the Netflix documentary Disclosure. Today we revisit our conversation with Cox about that film, which explores Hollywood's often negative portrayal of trans people, though sometimes film portrayals were, perhaps unintentionally, inspiring.
I don't know if the filmmakers had a black, trans, gender non-conforming kid in Mobile, Alabama in mind when they conceived of Yantel. I don't know if I was the target demographic for that, but like the disidentification that happened for me, where I saw my story and I saw myself in this character, something that like LGBTQI people have been doing for a very long time.
Cox and Disclosure director Sam Fader talk about hiring an almost all-trans crew to make their documentary Disclosure, which is now a finalist for a Peabody Award. But first, banter time. Stick around, it's the business from KCRW. I am joined by my fellow in banter, Matt Bellany. Hello, Matt.
Hi there.
So, Matt, we've talked about the fact that it is a huge story this year that Warner Media is being merged with Discovery, which, as we all know, is a purveyor of a lot of reality, and that David Zaslav, who is the chief executive at Discovery, is going to be running this combined entity. A very, very unlikely development. Normally, Hollywood would be like, who is this? Not just a TV guy running, the legacy property of Warner Media, but a reality TV guy, like, let us try to kill him. But these people have been so miserable under the so-called stewardship of AT&T, which is universally, I think, seen as a terrible failure, that they are just, please come in and save us from this. The problem is they can't come in right away, David Zaslav and whatever he intends to do, because there's going to be a year or more of federal review, antitrust considerations and so on. Zaslav has a hope to expedite this because both companies have been under the microscope at the Justice Department for other deals, and he is hoping that can move things along. I don't know how likely that is.
Yeah, both sides of this transaction recently went through tough federal review, most notably the AT&T acquisition of Time Warner, which Donald Trump tried to stop and turned into a whole legal proceeding and lasted, about 2 years. And even on the Discovery side, they recently bought Scripps, and there was a big review when that happened. And they're hoping that recent review will make this one a lot less complicated. But who knows? This is a different administration. There's different people involved, and it could take a long time. And that's potentially really bad for Warner's because we're in the middle of a streaming war here. This is a very key time in the history of media, and Netflix and Disney and Amazon are only getting bigger, and they're 100% focused on transitioning away from traditional television to the streaming universe, and Warner's is going to have to try while all of this chaos is going on.
Yeah, I think Zaslav is in particular concerned, I'm told, about these big, very deep-pocketed tech companies, and we know Amazon is just in the process of buying MGM, and, I don't know that MGM is a game changer for Amazon, but it's the kind of thing that they can do that and pay what's considered this crazy price and not blink. That's the kind of thing that makes someone like David Zaslav nervous when he is going to have his own challenges coming up with the money for this really expensive build to streaming. We know that is a total money suck, and so he wants to get in there, and I can't blame him. But meanwhile, it has led to this situation where somebody like Jason Kyler, head of Warner Media, who was at first reported to be negotiating like an instant out, he hired this attorney, Alan Grubman, and it's like supposedly said, give me my money and I'll go because clearly I'm not part of the future here. Then that pivoted to him telling the staff he is staying. Jason Kyler hasn't really meshed with the Hollywood content creator and creator-friendly executives in the community and their representatives. This has been a Silicon Valley meets creative Hollywood moment where it has gone kind of badly, notably the decision to put all the movies for 2021 on the streamer on the same day that they open in theaters. So he's going to stick around probably for a year, maybe. He has a lot of reasons to do that, but awkward. Here's this guy who seems like he's not going to be there, and he's there, and he's not the only one that people are wondering, does the future involve this person, that person? Ann Sarnoff, who runs the film and TV studios, Casey Bloys. For certain people like Jeff Zucker at CNN, he may stay. He was going to go if Kyler stayed, but Kyler's leaving. But this kind of instability and not knowing who's a lame duck, it's really hard for a staff that's been through a lot already.
Yeah, I mean, we know why Jason Kyler is staying. We learned this past week that he gets $20 million if he stays for a year. So that's not bad. And the rest of the company is just still reeling from this 5 to 7 years of total instability and leadership changes, going all the way back to the Jeff Bewkes bake-off, where he installed 3 separate executives atop Warner Brothers and essentially let them claw it out to see who would emerge victorious. And then when Kevin Tsujihara did emerge victorious, he went down in a sex scandal. And from there, it went on and on. They've had multiple leadership levels at HBO Max. They've had, John Stankey in charge of Warner Media, then he was promoted to run AT&T, and Kyler brought in. Warner Brothers itself has had a big executive turnover, especially on some of the creative side, not Toby Emmerich, but other executives there. And I just feel like there's this yearning on the Warner's lot for some level of stability that isn't coming in any meaningful way for at least a year or two.
I mean, one question is, does Toby Emmerich, the head of the film studio, remain? I think that there are forces at work in the town who are mad at him for a number of reasons, including that decision to put all the 21 movies on day and date. They have talked a lot publicly. I think Jason Kyler sort of did a semi-mea culpa. Maybe we could have done it better. Toby Emmerich just did an interview and talked about how this is not going to be the strategy for 22, and they're going to do some, 50-50 stuff to the streamer. They're making a lot of movies, so a lot of going to the streamer, and a bunch are all going to be theatrical. It feels like Hollywood is pumping the brakes, and they won't revise the 2021 all movies on the streamer strategy, even though I feel like there's a certain amount of pressure to do so. And one of the people who was supposedly, kind of blindsided among everybody else who was blindsided was John Chu, who made In the Heights. And I feel like, I don't know whether this is their sincere wish because cash is cash, or whether they are trying to make it up to John Chu, but they are, he and not only he, but Jason Kyler too, begging people on Twitter to go see this in the big screen in the movie theater. And, it does seem like a movie you would want to do that with, but it's just the stress on it almost feels like it's a performance because of what they did before, blindsiding this filmmaker who had made Crazy Rich Asians at Warner's, turning down more money from Netflix because he's a big screen guy.
Yeah, and he was financially very much rewarded for going with the big screen experience on Crazy Rich Asians and thought he could replicate it within the Heights. Now, let's not forget that Warner's did do a lot of mea culpa deal making with a lot of these major talents, including John Chu and Lin-Manuel Miranda on In the Heights. And what I am told is that, yes, people are bummed, but at least Warner's did that. There are rumblings about what Disney has been doing to the movies that are coming out this summer on premium video on demand, day and date with the theaters. And Disney isn't even doing that. They're just putting the premium video on demand revenue in with the box office revenue. And that's not the same thing as making good on what you would have made if this movie came out in normal times. It's a little bit complicated, but at least Warner's is making noises or gestures towards the talent and trying to do a mea culpa here. I don't think the town is going to turn against Toby Emmerich in that same way. I think the blame for all of this is going to be on AT&T, and at least if there is a message that there's a new sheriff in town and that things are going to change, I think Toby probably gets out of this alive, but we'll see.
Look, I am going to disagree with you 100%. I think Toby may get out of it alive in that he is one of those guys on the Zoom calls that David Zaslav has with this circle of industry friends or business friends, that he's been part of that world. But I completely disagree. I don't know anyone in the town who is going to forget the way that was handled. And even though Toby Emmerich has kind of conveyed that, yes, he did kind of come up with the idea to put these things on day and date, and that was his thought, he did not want it to be a thing that blindsided people. And I'm just going to sit here and say 100% that people don't care about that nuance. They blame him, and even though they like the check and they like that Warner's had to pay much more money than they intended to make it go away, the fact of the matter is they're never going to forget it. And as long as this group is still in the chair in Hollywood, that will be remembered. Whether it affects Zaslav's evaluation, we don't know.
Okay, but you know what? I think that nuance does matter, because doing something in a way that involves the talent is basically what Disney is doing. And the other studios are going to follow. And this is the future. and they know what they're getting into and they have that flexibility, then I think it's okay, and I think that people will understand. But, Brian Lord gave a quote to the LA Times this past week that says, no, he's not over it yet. So I think you're right that there is anger out there.
He doesn't go on the record like that very often. Those Brian Lord CAA guys don't do that very often. So I note that and I say, talent will get over it if you loop them in. But the fact that Toby Bailey said, I want to do it, but I didn't want to do it this way, that is the nuance that's lost. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
That's Matt Bellany, a founding partner of a new media outlet. We'll learn more about that soon. Coming up after a short break, I inadvertently helped actress and producer Laverne Cox update her online dating profile. You're listening to The Business from KCRW.
KCRW sponsors include Apple TV Plus, presenting the comedy series Ted Lasso, starring Jason Sudeikis as a small-time college football coach from Kansas, hired to coach a professional soccer team in England despite having no experience. Los Angeles Times said, it isn't just a TV show, it's a vibe. More at fyc.appletvplus.com.
This is The Business, and I'm Kim Masters. Hollywood's depictions of trans people and the impact of those portrayals on the trans audience is the subject of the 2020 Netflix documentary Disclosure, which is now a finalist for a Peabody Award. The film draws on decades of archival footage from Bugs Bunny to Yentl to Silence of the Lambs. Today we're revisiting a conversation with Disclosure director Sam Fader and executive producer Laverne Cox, who's also a subject of the film. In 2014, Cox made history as the first openly transgender actor to be Emmy nominated for her role in Orange is the New Black. As Cox points out in Disclosure, trans characters have been a crucial part of movies and television long before shows like Orange is the New Black and FX's Pose, but they were often not portrayed in a way that was positive.
I think for a very long time, the ways in which trans people have been represented on screen have suggested that we're not real, have suggested that we're mentally ill, that we don't exist. And yet, here I am. Yet here we are. And we've always been here.
I think you said, Sam, that you've been working on it for years. So if you could just walk me through when you started and learn when you became involved, that would be great.
Yeah, there were two documentaries that really changed my life, and those were In a Celluloid Closet, which is about gay and lesbian representation in Hollywood, and Ethnic Notions, which is about Black representation in film in Hollywood. And I always wanted to see that history for trans people with that critique and analysis and nuance. And then, there we are in 2014, and trans visibility was increasing, and mainstream society was talking about it more than ever, and I really wanted to give trans and non-trans people more context to understand these changes in our culture and understand the history and how we got to this point of visibility.
So 3 years ago, I had been living here in Los Angeles for a year and was missing community, and went on social media and saw that two friends of mine, Angelica Ross and Jen Richards, were on a panel for a talk at Outfest. And I jumped out of my bed on a Saturday morning and didn't put any makeup on and just got into a lift and went to the panel. And I walked into the auditorium, and my friend Nick Adams, who works at GLAAD, said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. My friend Sam is here doing a presentation at the Celluloid Closet." And I immediately sort of, my ears perked up, because I've always wanted to do a project that was a sort of Celluloid Closet, if you will. And I sat in the audience and watched Sam's presentation. It was so moved and disturbed and deeply impressed by the research that he had done and the scope of the project and the ambition of the project. And we met afterwards, and then we agreed to meet a week later, I think it was, and I said I'd love to be involved in this project, and he said yes, come on board, and here we are 3 years later.
So Sam, how far were you into it by then?
So that was July 2017, so 2 years.
And I just wondered, did you see Laverne as an angel sent from heaven to?
I mean,
you should be doing my breath there. I mean, I see you by my dictionary. Angel sent from heaven.
You can quote Kim on that.
I endorse that message.
My career is fine, but the dating, I need some endorsements there.
We're here to help. her trust to have her be involved in the project. We had friends in common, but I knew I wanted to take my time and bring her in. But so when I saw her in the audience at that presentation, I was thrilled. I was thrilled because I could immediately see that she was engaged. And when we spoke afterwards, her excitement and passion was just, I knew it was a perfect match.
So Laverne, you were ready to trust. You didn't like vet Sam. You felt like, I can feel this guy is the right guy. I met with Sam. I mean, there's always a little vetting. But when I met with Sam and Amy Shoulder, our producer, I felt the sincerity of it. I felt that their hearts were so in the right place with wanting to make this project. And I took a leap of faith and I followed my gut. A lot of it was my gut though. And oh, how glorious it has been. It really has been a great joy. I'm so deeply honored to be in partnership with you, Sam, and Amy on this. It's just been really fantastic. I mean, it's been hard. Raising money to make this movie has been really, really hard. But I can't believe we're here. It's just that's an honor, really. Now, Sam, I think you have a director's statement in the press materials that I found really interesting. And I'm just going to read it really, really quick. That you and Amy Shoulder had committed to 4 rules. Only trans people are featured in the interviews, and they are creative consultants who are paid for their time. 2, all archival footage ideas will be contextualized by the personal memories and perspectives shared in the interview. 3, instead of chronological, you're going to follow people's memories as they wrestle with the past. And 4, you prioritized hiring trans production crew, and when you couldn't, you had a non-trans person hired who would mentor an emerging trans filmmaker. I mean, not moving chronologically creates issues. You go all the way back to D.W. Griffith in the film. But, for me, I know the easiest structure is chronological structure.
Yeah, I think the way we internalize information is not chronological, right? We bounce back and forth. These things are constantly in dialogue. The past is always in dialogue with the present. And so it felt like it really gave a lot more insight to follow people's emotional landscape, their emotional memories, and not do this sort of film history in a chronological way that we've seen before. There is a certain utility to following something chronologically, but I also just think it's more cinematic and more enjoyable to experience the nostalgia of memory.
Laverne, you came in and you mentioned money raising. Is that what you saw? I mean, you're obviously on the screen in both as a performer and a talking head, for want of a better phrase. Did you see that part of your mission was to go out there, and how did you get the money in the end? I'm not a money raising person. I felt like my role was to help, to use my platform to elevate the project. And then I am into being a creative producer. I'm into the storytelling. I'm into how things are being told. I helped a lot with casting and all that stuff. But I love how a story is told. Obviously, Sam has a singular vision, but I loved being in collaboration with Sam on all of that. Just the creative part of putting the film together. I just love that stuff. Now, it's interesting how one of the themes in the film is that trans people, as young people growing up, are just looking for that representation so hungrily, really. And then when they see it, so many times it's a portrayal of someone who's a murderer or a duplicitous. It almost felt like watching it. I think somebody even says, just something is better than nothing. At least this was something they could relate to. Yeah, and I think that's the brilliance of Sam's idea of sort of relying on our memories as trans people and relying on the things where we saw identification. I always love to allude to Jose Munoz, who was a professor of performance studies at NYU. He's passed away now. He wrote this beautiful book called Disidentification. And the way he defines disidentification is, he says, paraphrasing, that is a specific thing that marginalized people, particularly queer people, if he's not represented as queer, but he's used the term queer people have used to situate ourselves in narratives that were not culturally coded for us to identify with, right? So that, like, for me, for example, to see myself in Intel, and I don't know if the filmmakers had a black, trans kid, junior non-conforming kid in Mobile, Alabama in mind when they conceived of Angel. I don't know if I was the target demographic for that, but like the disidentification that happened for me, where I saw my story, I saw myself, and this character is something that like LGBTQI people have been doing for a very long time, and so I think that's the brilliance of relying on memory, and that's the brilliance of listening to trans people in terms of how we, what our spectatorship has been in relationship to film and television.
Yeah, and one of the other things that you try to achieve in the film, because Hollywood does have a great deal to answer for, not only with trans people, but all kinds of people, is the idea that people can come to a better place. And I think you very much using Ryan Murphy in that context, going from this very, the tired portrayal in Nip Tuck to Pose, which is, I think seems to have been such a game changer.
Yeah, and I think the thing about that is that it's not even singling out Ryan Murphy. Ryan Murphy is like he's a lovely man who've met many times. This is what everyone was doing at the time. Everyone was doing problematic representation of trans people. Everyone was sensationalizing our identities and dehumanizing. That was basically standard fare at the time of Nip Tuck and so many other things. And so the times have changed. And I think what is so beautiful about seeing what has happened with Ryan is that the different awareness is truly transformative. I mean, Pose is for LGBTQ people, for trans people of color. It is groundbreaking on every level that you can really imagine and think of in terms of who is working behind the scenes. I mean, consultants, makeup artists, directors, producers, writers, trans people, LGBTQI plus people at every level of the production. That is game changing, and it's made careers for new folks. I mean, Janet Mock, it's safe to say that he's an intern, or just the same insanely gorgeous, amazing deal at Netflix now. She's directing and writing and producing, and Our Lady J. I mean, it's just incredible. So it's been such, and not to mention what it's done for the brilliant actors on the show. So it is absolutely beautiful and brilliant, and that the times can change, and that we can change with it.
This statement that I mentioned earlier involves, trying to hire trans people for your crew. How difficult or not difficult was it?
Right. So, we were committed to we prioritized hiring a trans crew. And when we couldn't hire a trans person, we mentored a trans person. And we did do a national search to hire key crew roles. What was particularly exciting about the mentorship is that not only were the fellows, the mentees, given a new skill set and resources and connections, but the mentors also were given insight into intimate personal experiences. And our gaffer was so moved by her relationship with the fellowship and by being part of this set that she went back to IATSE, which is the largest tech union in the world, and instituted the first trans sensitivity training. So the domino effect of prioritizing trans crew was incredible. And certainly, I think I'm just proud of that in the project.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you did train people who will go on and work in the industry, hopefully.
Yeah.
Just got to be a very good feeling. So even as we have just had the Supreme Court ruling that defends trans rights, we see this controversy around J.K. Rowling and her comments. And Warner Brothers issued a statement that was rather anodyne. Obviously J.K. Rowling is hugely important to Warner Brothers, but is it disheartening? I mean, I feel like she was on the right side of so many things, and I don't know why she needed to engage on this, but she isn't letting it go. And
no, she's not.
I think it's broken a lot of hearts,
No, I mean, honestly, I mean, at this point, I'm not surprised. These comments are not new, and I don't really have anything else to say about it. I don't. I think there are lots of people who feel lots of different ways. I think because she's famous and she wrote a beloved book series that people are very upset. And I don't want to dismiss or discount people who are devastated and disappointed and all of those things. But I don't know. I just feel like I'm not surprised when people hold these ideas. I think that strategy of divide and conquer, here I am talking about it again, but the divide and conquer piece of pitting women's rights against trans rights, I think that is deeply, deeply problematic. And I don't know if that's not even about her, that's about the strategy of divide and conquer. It's about how it works to pit marginalized people against each other. That dismays me a bit. I think it's something that we just need to be aware of and be conscious of. The divide and conquer business, the scarcity piece of thinking that someone else getting rights is somehow going to take rights from me. That scarcity thinking, and I think that is deeply problematic. And I think again it pits marginalized people against each other.
This sort of mythology that feminism and trans rights are, in opposition to each other is such a myth. I mean, I really do think disclosure could enlighten JK to the roots of her patriarchal fantasies and those who stand behind it.
We can't make this about JK. So yeah, we're making it about JK because JK is a billionaire and wrote this beloved series. It's like there's a whole system in place to take away trans rights. So we focusing our energy on someone just because they're famous and a billionaire is like, it's a mistake. Let's change the system. Let's change the systems. Our energy should not be placed there. Our energy should be placed on changing the systems that are trying to oppress trans folks.
Having achieved this film, which I think is a really important film, and I hope many people watch it, Sam or Sam and Laverne, I don't know. Do you have another? I know you're doing multiple. Like there's a book, there's a web thing, right? There's all kinds of stuff that you're doing. Is there another film project you have in mind?
There are a lot of projects underway that I'm not totally ready to talk about, but one would be a series, and I would love to make a film on Lou Sullivan, who's a trans male pioneer. There's some scripted projects in the works, so there's a lot, and Laverne is working constantly.
Thank God. Yeah, we're developing a few different projects, and one thing that comes to mind is that as we were making this film, Supergirl happened, and Euphoria happened, and so many, which are included in our film, but we didn't have time to do a deep dive into what the shifts that have happened with. I mean, Euphoria feels like a major shift to me in terms of trans representation. So things have shifted in terms of what's out there to talk about.
There's plenty of material to work with.
Oh yeah.
Laverne Cox is the executive producer, and Sam Fader is the director of the documentary Disclosure, now on Netflix. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.
That's The Business. Caitlin Parker produced and edited today's program with help this week from Desmond Hummer. Paul Smith makes the show. You can stream The Business as well as other great KCR Clean podcasts on the KCRW app. Masters, we'll see you next week on The Business.
It's your new sponsors and
Cool.
Netflix presents.
Welcome to Big Achievement Podcast about television writing and becoming a TV writer. I'm Alex Friedman, aka TV Colin. And I'm Nick Watson on Twitter @_NJ Watson. And today we are taking a look at the outlining process in television writing. Whether you are working on your own simple scripts or asked to deliver outlines in a writer's room, what are some things to watch out for? Let's find out. Alright, first up, this section is going to be about outlines in your own work, and that's whether you are writing an original pilot as a sample or to staff or sell. And this section was actually inspired from a question from one of our listeners, Michael, who sent in an email. That's right, and he said, quote, "Hi guys, really been digging the mentorship series, and I especially like the chance to see the outline stage of a pilot. I would be very interested in a broader discussion on this stage of the process, and might make for a good episode topic down the road. A specific question from my perspective as an up-and-comer is it worth it to draft an outline when writing a spec pilot? I actually tried writing an outline for my last pilot and found it to be very helpful. Surprisingly, I actually found that it allowed me to write more freely on the first draft without having to worry about big story decisions or scene framing. I had more room to focus on the writing of the scene itself." Thanks again for the podcast. You guys are at the top of my podcast list along with script notes whenever new episodes come out. Thank you, Michael. Let me turn to Nick and ask him directly, do you outline your content, and what does that look like?
Absolutely. Personally, I think that the most important part of writing TV scripts is outlining. My favorite part is probably the brainstorming and blue skying part, and my least favorite part is writing the first draft. The part that makes or breaks a good script in my mind is just a really strong outline to go off of.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you just said. I think we're a perfect match in terms of our approach to outlining. I also agree that outlining, if you're writing a sample, a script, a pilot, anything, is one of the most critical steps in TV writing. In fact, in my mind, the general idea of outlining is what you would be doing in a writer's room when you're breaking the story. You're going from an idea, the inception of this concept of these basic scenes or things that you want to happen in the episode, to something more concrete, to an actual story process, something that you can follow characters' arcs, themes, etc. in a basic form, so at least intellectually you understand what you're trying to achieve emotionally and narratively.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point to bring up. You're not going to be writing the script for every single episode of the TV writer's room, but you are going to be helping break the story points and the structure. So Michael hinted at in his own email, the fact that once you have the outline process, and I'm kind of fast forwarding to the end of it when you actually have the document, but once you have that document, it allows you to navigate those scenes in that first draft more freely. You're able to focus on things that are important to focus on, namely giving emotions to scene, the dialogue, the scene work in of itself, as opposed to the nuances of structure, the nuances of act breaks, and things that are more structural in their nature, which, I mean, I personally enjoy, but I know a lot of people, when they think of writing, they think more about the creative nature of writing to a blank page and so forth. But I think it's pretty limiting in the reality of how you're actually writing, because nobody writes in a vacuum, nobody writes to a blank page. We're making decisions, even if you are writing to quote-unquote a blank page, you're still writing linearly. You're writing scene 1, scene 2, blah, blah, but you still have an idea or a shape of an idea of where you're going. And an outline concretizes those things. It doesn't live in your mind. It's actually on the page. So that's, in my mind, why an outline is so important.
Yeah, and I think that Michael said in his question, it kind of frees you up a little bit to not be stressing about, the bigger picture and all of these points and making it the right things, because you've already put that in place, that it's already there. You can really just focus on each individual scene and making that scene the best that it can be without having to stress about everything else. The other thing for me is that, writing a pilot is intimidating. It's a big process. There are so many steps to it, and you can't just sort of open up a final draft document and start writing and expect to have a fully formed, amazing pilot come out of your fingertips. So it really, really helps me personally, and I'm sure a lot of people, to break it down into these smaller steps and focus on one thing at a time. So that way it makes everything just a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's a great point about the productivity nature of that document. The fact that you are breaking the whole process of, getting from the 0 pages to 30 or 60. You can't just do that in one sitting. You have to break it down into micro steps. And the outline is certainly one of the most important steps. Another reason why I want to say to all the points that we're making about why an outline is important is because what the document allows you to do later on with your draft, all those machinations you have, all the decisions and questions you have about your pilot, which are usually going to be the most cumbersome things to figure out in terms of plots, things to figure out in terms of what the acts look like, in terms of where you want the pilot to end or begin, or the way characters behave in a general way, you will be in the process of making those decisions when you write that outline. And so the burden of all those decisions are happening in the outline. And intrinsically, when you're writing the outline, I also feel it clarifies a lot of my vision, but it also allows another kind of freedom within the story. I can kind of do whatever I want in terms of the story because I know this is the step I'm going to be focusing on in regards to the story, the structure, all those things. Once I get to the draft, I will never make those decisions again. So that's why I focus on the outline stage in particular, because I know this is the point where I'm going to be making those decisions. And that frees me to make those decisions as opposed to think about dialogue things or any other nature.
I think one of the other really great things that outlining does for you is that it makes it so much easier to change things and fix them at the outline step rather than writing your whole entire script and then realizing, oh no, this structural beat isn't working, or I wanted to rework this particular character arc here, or the story point, or change things around. Then you would have to go in and pull your whole script apart and maybe rewrite the entire thing. If you've done that at the outline and then you've gotten the thoughts and notes and feedback, or you just realized yourself that something needs to change, it's a lot easier to just go to your outline, type up one paragraph different, or pull something out than it is to retake an entire script.
That's exactly why we made the outline a step in the mentorship. Once you have an outline, you have an actual document that you can get feedback on and adjust as desired. Whereas if you go from basically a beat sheet or nothing to a draft, those notes that you're going to have to address are going to be fundamental, almost structural notes that are going to take a lot more work, as opposed to what Nick said, which is once you have an outline, the tweaks you can make, either in the process of going to draft, or if you want to make a second outline, that's also perfectly fine. But either way, having that stopgap, you can give that to people and get feedback on a document that actually gives an idea, maybe not emotionally, but at least intellectually gives the person an idea of the story and what you're trying to accomplish. On that note, we've talked a lot about the positives of outlining, but let me ask you, has there been any times when you've decided not to outline a project?
Yeah, I think very occasionally, certainly much earlier in my career or interest in writing, when you're first starting out, I think a lot of people just tend to kind of jump in and see where it goes and see what happens. And sometimes that can be fun, and sometimes that can be freeing to just kind of jump into a scene and start writing it. And I think that there is certainly some value to that, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it as a long-term strategy or something to kind of do all the time. I know that some people do feel that outlining takes away some of that creative freedom to go wherever they want if they find something
in a scene that they want to do differently, but I don't think it's an either or thing, honestly. I think that you can then go back to your outline, adjust, and take it from there, and so you're not locked into exactly what you need to do once you're in the scene.
Exactly, yeah. You can go from outline to draft and still reassess the scene order. The example you just quoted about, I want to put this scene before this other scene. When you're writing the draft, you don't have to necessarily be locked into the outline. If you feel like now that you're in the draft process, you'll be moving this scene after that scene and so forth. But the outline gives you the 100 feet perspective on the entire story. And so at least you know if you're moving that piece, then there's a domino effect because this other scene is going to be affected and so forth. Now, personally, have I ever done a project without outlining? I would say to me, it's less of a binary yes-no as opposed to the granularity in which I outline. I have done pilots, in fact, I'm writing right now a pilot, in which I don't necessarily have a fully fledged outline. I just have an extensive beat sheet where I know structurally, linearly, where every scene happens, but I don't necessarily know the exact details of the dialogue or the conversation or all those things. I just kind of know, broadly speaking, this is the goal of this scene, that is the out of that scene, and that's why, in terms of the order of things, that's the document that indicates the structural idea of that episode. To me, that's where I'm at on the spectrum, is I'm probably evolve on one side or the other, where I'm going to be creating a document that's more granular as opposed to less granular. In terms of not outlining at all, I can't say that personally I've really done it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes if you want to shake things up or kind of do a bit of writing and get your creative instincts out in there and see if something comes from that, it's totally fine to do it every now and then. But I would say in general, it's good practice to use an outline or at the very least a beat sheet type document. And I don't honestly think there are that many cons to outlining overall because it can still change. You're not sacrificing anything by having an outline. You're just giving yourself extra tools at your disposal.
Another aspect of outlining that is great for me is just having something to show the linear context of the story. I can sort of read a document and see how everything flows. Whereas before an outline, I don't have that document. Even if it's like a beat sheet, I have like ideas of scenes maybe, but with an outline, you actually can understand and see for the first time, this is what the episode would look like. Does it fit with the flow? Does it fit with the tone? Does it fit with the pacing of it? All those things you can certainly adjust with a draft, but it's moving huge pieces around as opposed to an outline that's much more succinct and to that point. So we've looked at some pros and cons of the outline, but what is your process in terms of getting into the outline? How early in that process do you sit down and do that outline?
I would say it's sort of the early to middle of the process. I like to spend a lot of time brainstorming and writing things down and letting things gestate and just kind of slowly letting these ideas form in my head. I like to think a lot about the themes and what I'm really saying and what I'm exploring with this stuff and focusing on the concept and how I can kind of maximize all those dynamics and everything. But then, once I have a little bit more of a solid idea, I'd like to kind of put much bigger tentpole things in my head too, in terms of like big act breaks or huge moments that are going to happen in there. And so then once I have a better idea of that, I find that that's where it's helpful to jump into the outline, slot those big moments in that you're working around, and then find some of the kind of sinew and connective tissue between those in your outline.
We're relatively close, even though we're in different genres and formats. My process is very similar in that, like you, I like to do a lot of background processing initially. Once I have an idea for a pilot, a character, a story, I try to think of interesting scenes or momentum that I want to create and shapes of scenes. But at the point where I know, for example, the teaser is going to be that, and end of Act 1 is going to be that, and end of the episode is going to be this scene that is going to be really impactful. But once I sort of have an idea of key scenes in that structure, then I'm going to start the outlining process in earnest, opening up a document and typing those scenes in order of where they should go. And then it's about filling the rest of the puzzle, where I have the beginning of the act and the end of the act, but what goes in the middle. I sort of know where it ends. So what do I need to fill out? The idea, those thoughts, are being crystallized into an actual document.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I found times where I've written an outline, I've gone and written the script, and then as the script has kind of changed and been rewritten, it's diverged enough from the outline that I've actually found it useful to go back and kind of reverse engineer it back into an outline again so that I can see it from that perspective correctly and make sure that those structural beats are hitting and character arcs and things like that are happening correctly across the episode, because it has perhaps changed enough from that initial outline that I want to make sure I haven't missed something or something isn't going wrong with it. So an outline doesn't always just have to be a new step in the process that you can never go back to either.
I would say that's kind of the key of an outline. It's supposed to unlock the story, the structure, all those things. You should not be going to a draft with any of those questions, or at least if you have them, then you can always revert back to the outline. I will say personally, from the drama side, an outline
is critical to understanding the story. So you can't write an outline too early, in the sense that the outline may take you forever to get through, perhaps, but it's never too early to start an outline, because that's the first step to understanding the structure and all those things. And especially in a 1 hour show, for example, you have so much plot and story, it is important to visualize those things and understand how they interconnect with one another.
Yeah, I think it's very easy once you spend long enough on the script and you're kind of down in the trenches. I think everyone's had that experience where it just stops making sense to you, where you're so deep in it that you can't really see it from a different perspective again, and that's where I find it useful to go back to the outline or to reapproach the outline again and be able to see things outside of the trenches of the story.
And on that note, this is something that we have talked about a little bit, but how do we approach actually writing the document? What does it look like for you to be writing an outline? What does it mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you do want even more detail on this, we did have an episode called From Outline to First Draft, which was BT 28. You can go back and listen to that for some more kind of tips and tricks and structure and process there. Just personally for me, like I mentioned earlier, I think those really big tentpole moments are so important because they allow you to frame everything else around them. Once you know what the midpoint is, what the kind of cold open is, that starts to give you more and more information and pieces of the puzzle. You can then go around and figure out how you work up to those moments, how you set them up, and how they're going to pay off. And so approaching it, I think, from the top down in that respect and getting more granular as you go is useful for the outline. I like to use scene headings, break it down scene by scene, and figure out where I'm going, where things are going to take place, and then just put a paragraph of description as to what happens in each scene, so that's sort of like my little guide to write it, and I can just go through and actually write each of those scenes properly with dialogue and characters and action once I'm ready to do a script.
I'm also of the belief that starting with those tentpole moments and filling in the corners of that puzzle is very important to give you an idea of the pacing of that episode, to give you an idea of this is the moment where I'm going to reveal that X person is the killer, or this is the disease that this patient has, or some major twist in your story. Those are the moments that drive the momentum forward. And so now that you understand, okay, Act 2 is going to be the big reveal, then you can backfill it. Okay, well, I need to set up these pieces, hopefully in an entertaining way, but at least intellectually you understand this is going to be the place where I'm filling in those pieces. To me, an outline is kind of the first document that resembles an actual script. In other words, I'm going to final draft kind of for the first time in an outline. Once I'm delivering an outline to me, it means with scene headings, it means with content of the scene. Very rarely do I include dialogue or things that I believe are more for the first draft or drafts. But with that said, I still want to give an idea of the emotion I'm trying to get at. Now, if it's just an internal document, which in a way this is just for my own edification, then I can be as detailed or not detailed as I want, as long as I understand, once I go to first draft, that this is what the scene is about. This is what I'm trying to convey. This is sort of the point of the scene, the goal of the scene, both on a character level and a story level, etc., etc. And so as long as I understand personally what this does, then I'm good with that outline. Now, conversely, if this is a document that goes to other people, then there's a different dynamic that comes into play, because it's about conveying those ideas to other people, and that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, in terms of kind of how detailed we get into these outlines, a lot of that is personal preference. It's what works for you. Will you find it useful to have more information to pull from your outline and put into your scripts? Great. If you find it easier to have a very loose skeleton of what's going in there and allow you to come up with the ideas in the moment, awesome too. Like we said, this is a personal reference document for you when you're writing your own stuff, so do whatever works for you. I know that a lot of people do like to put in key dialogue lines that they've thought of. I find that the distinction for me, if you're dropping dialogue into an outline, it really needs to be an important line that serves some sort of purpose. You never need any of the little filler lines of like exposition or like, what did she say? Well, she said this and that sort of thing. It's if there's some big revelation bombshell moment that comes in, or some really like awesome line that you've thought up, or a really funny joke, sure, put it in there in little quotation marks in the outline, but you really don't want to be writing the entire scene. Generally less is more in the outline stage.
I think the litmus test is if you were to remove that quote or that line, would the scene still make sense? Would the prose still make sense, convey the emotion of the story? If it does, then just remove it. But if it is a very impactful moment, then perhaps you should include it. So, for example, I've never seen the outline for the finale of Lost Season 3, but I would bet money that the very end of that outline we have to go back. Such an impactful moment and line, and we understand what's happening here. The pivotal moment in that scene that we understand we have to go back past tense. Oh my god, Jack is off the island. This is a flash forward, not a flashback. That line of dialogue does a lot of heavy lifting that maybe a line of prose may not convey.
So that brings us to sort of the last question in this section, which is, when do we actually stop writing that outline and go to draft? How do we know that we're ready?
That's another question that's very hard to be prescriptive on. Personally, I believe that the point where I move to first draft from an outline is the point where I believe I figured out the story. And I figured out kind of the pieces, the intellectual pieces, so to speak, of that story. I understand the whole structure. I don't need to restructure everything. I understand exactly where the acts begin, where they end, where every scene fits, why the characters are doing what they're doing, etc., etc. And the first draft is almost shaping that document. It's almost adding that magic of the emotion, the magic of the dialogue, the magic of the scene work that you cannot get in an outline.
Yeah, if you think about your outline as sort of a roadmap to get to your destination, which is a finished pilot, you would never go and take a series of Google Maps directions that were missing like 3 of the key steps, because you're going to get there and you're going to be like, oh no, what do I do now? And you're trying to get to this other point that you know needs to happen, but you don't actually know how to get there properly. And sure, you can make it up, you can take your best guess, you can kind of turn down some streets and hope you got to the right place, but I think that you're going to be in a much better position if you wait until you have all of the directions that you need to get to your destination.
Right, and that will completely depend on who you are as a person and what you need from the document. If you are someone who needs every single step of, the murder mystery figured out before you go to draft, then that's probably something you need to figure out in the outline. You need to have that mapped out completely. But if you're someone who doesn't need that much plot and can kind of figure it out, it's much more a character-based pilot, then the broad strokes of the character actions may be sufficient. And then in the first draft, that's when you get the emotion of those scenes out.
Yeah, exactly. Going back to my sort of directions metaphor, you don't need to list every single street you're going to drive past on the 5 miles of straight that you're driving, but you do want to know when you need to make that important right turn
towards Peter Street.
Exactly.
So we spent a little bit of time looking at outlines in the context of your own samples, but now let's move to the more professional environment. You are staff, you're in your writer's room, and you are asked to deliver outlines. The reason why we are kind of creating a whole section just about this is because a few days ago, there was a whole Twitter debate online about different showrunners, APs, and writers having different opinions on what should be delivered in a writer's room and different approaches therein, because the outline, if you're a professional, is more than just a tool to guide you to the finished product. It's an actual creative deliverable rather than just that internal document. It's something that other people will be looking at to judge or give notes or do something like that on your episode and on your show. So that's a completely different dynamic than just a reference document.
Absolutely, and I think it would help for us to kind of remind everybody what the general steps of each of these documents are in a professional writer's room, and each room will be different naturally, especially sometimes it would be comedy and drama. There may be less steps, depends on what your network wants to. A lot of this is kind of mileage may vary, however, very broadly on an episode basis in terms of documents, not talking about season-long story docs or arcs, just on an episodic basis. The first thing you have is going to be something like a synopsis or a logline or a premise. It's a sentence essentially about what this episode is about. The next one is a story area, which is, I guess, a little bit more detailed than that. We're kind of getting into maybe some more of the ideas, the themes. We're getting into which characters are going to be involved in this, maybe some of the broader strokes of the big moments that are going to happen throughout. But again, it's sort of a looser kind of feel of like, here's roughly what we're planning on doing with the story. And again, that's another document that the networks like to have so they can give really big picture feedback before you dive into the specifics. After that, you have more of a beat sheet, and that's where you do actually have each of the sort of plot points of the story and the character arcs and everything mapped out in, again, a bigger picture kind of way, but they still are concrete. This happens, then this happens, and this happens, leading to this. For beat sheet, that's usually what you would then take to the full outline, which we just talked about, and then you take the outline to the script, and at each stage, each of those usually need to be approved by the showrunner, the producers, the network, etc.
That's right. As Nick mentioned, every show, every genre also lives on a different part of that spectrum. Some people will want all those documents. Other people may just want one or a different version of others and so forth. So let's really ask ourselves here, why are outlines or outline-esque documents important in this context? Why are they asked for in a professional settings? And the first reason is because you got to remember, you live in an ecosystem. You live with executives, people that need to know what is going on in your writer's room. And so you have deliverables to give out to, for example, your network executives, your studio executives, so that they know what you're working on. They understand, hopefully, that this is episode 9 and this is what's going to happen in episode 9. And so it goes from, as I mentioned before, an internal document for your own edification and your own writer's room reference to a document that's going to be delivered to outside the writer's room.
Exactly, we always say television is collaborative medium. It is about sort of teamwork and compromise and working with other people around you. And like Alex said, we have a number of steps and a number of people that get to have creative approvals over this. They are the people that are essentially paying to make this show, and they're putting this is what we're thinking. What do you think? You get your feedback then you go into more detail at each step, and that essentially